4 structural engineers looked at the foundation of Lena Hartwell's building and gave her the same answer: condemn it, tear it down. The combined demolition and rebuild estimates had reached $1.4 million by the time the 4th report landed on her desk, and she was sitting with a pen in her hand, prepared to authorize the first invoice, when her site manager knocked on the doorframe and said a name she had never heard: a retired man who ran a one-person inspection service out of a converted workshop on the edge of Steinbach, Manitoba. Someone named Walter Greer, who had no website and no business card, and who her site manager had found through a lumberyard contact who had known him for 30 years. Lena Hartwell had built Hartwell Property Group into one of the most respected mid-market commercial developers in Winnipeg before she turned 40, and she had done it the way people build things that last, slowly, carefully, without shortcuts, and with a clarity about what she was willing to accept that most people in her industry considered excessive, and that she considered simply accurate. She did not approve a project without reading the full engineering file. She did not sign a contract without understanding every clause in it. She had fired 2 contractors in the same week once because one of them had called her cautious as though it were a liability, and the other had smiled when she said it. The building in question was a 4-story mixed-use property on the corner of a quiet commercial block in the north end of the city, a building Hartwell Property Group had purchased 18 months earlier as part of a portfolio acquisition, a building that had stood without incident since 1987, and that had been flagged during a routine inspection the previous autumn for what the inspector described as anomalous cracking patterns in the northeast corner of the foundation. The flagging had triggered a full structural review. The structural review had triggered 3 additional opinions, and now across 4 separate reports from 4 separate firms, the verdict was unanimous and expensive and final sounding in the way that expensive verdicts tend to sound. The foundation had failed, not partially, not in a way that could be stabilized or patched. The concrete had undergone a process one report described as advanced alkali silica reactivity, a chemical deterioration that had been progressing silently for years and had reached a stage that, in the professional judgment of every engineer who had reviewed it, was past the threshold of structural viability. The building needed to come down, the land could be rebuilt on, but the building itself was finished. Lena had not argued with any of them. She had asked precise questions, received precise answers, and thanked each of them for their time in a tone that communicated both gratitude and the clear understanding that she would be seeking additional information regardless. What she had not done was sign anything. There was a version of her that wanted to. The version that ran on efficiency and trusted credentials, and understood that sometimes the most expensive answer was simply the correct one. But there was something underneath that version, something older and harder to name, that had been sitting quietly in the room with her each time a new report arrived, and it had not moved, and she had learned over many years to pay attention to what did not move. Her site manager was a man named Doug Price, 53 years old, who had been on construction sites in Manitoba since he was 16, and who possessed the particular brand of calm that comes from having seen things go wrong in ways that no manual ever quite predicted. He did not offer opinions freely. He offered them when he was confident and not before, which was part of why Lena had kept him for 9 years. When he knocked on her doorframe that afternoon, he was holding a small piece of paper folded once, and he set it on her desk the way someone sets down something they are not entirely sure about but have decided to say anyway. Walter Greer, he told her, was 71 years old. He had retired 6 years ago from a position he had held for over 3 decades at the National Research Council in Ottawa, where he had worked in a division focused on building materials and durability, specifically on the long-term behavior of concrete in northern climate conditions. He had published research. He had testified before a federal building code panel. He had been cited in the standard reference document that every structural engineer in Canada was supposed to have read, and that Doug suspected at least 2 of the 4 firms had not read recently enough. After retirement, he had moved back to the town he was from, bought a small property outside Steinbach, and started doing private consultations for people who found him through word of mouth alone, because he had no interest in marketing himself, and because the work he found through word of mouth was, in his experience, the work that actually needed doing. Doug had found him through a man at a lumberyard who had once watched Walter Greer look at a failing retaining wall for 4 minutes and correctly identify a drainage issue that 2 licensed engineers had missed entirely. Lena picked up the paper. She looked at the address. She looked at Doug. She said that she was not sure what a retired NRC researcher operating out of Steinbach could tell her that 4 licensed structural engineers had not already said. Doug said he understood that. Then he said that the lumberyard contact had mentioned something else. A grain storage facility in the Interlake region 3 years ago had been condemned by the regional municipality following a structural assessment recommending demolition. The owner had been given 60 days to vacate and begin teardown. He had called Walter Greer. Walter Greer had driven out, spent 2 days on the property, and submitted a report to the municipality that identified the original assessment as correct in its description of the damage and incorrect in its conclusion about the cause. The cause mattered because it changed the remedy. The facility had been saved. The owner had paid Walter Greer $800 for 2 days of work and the kind of clear-eyed thinking that had apparently not been available to anyone else who had looked at the building. Lena put the paper down. She looked out her window at the gray November sky and thought about something her father had said to her when she was still young enough to absorb lessons without needing to have learned them the hard way first. He had told her that in construction, the most dangerous word was obvious. Not because things were never obvious, but because obvious stopped people from looking. She picked up the paper again and told Doug to make the call. Walter Greer answered on the second ring. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where precision mattered and had long since stopped needing to perform anything at all. He listened to Doug's explanation without interrupting. At the end of it, he said he could come Thursday, that he would need access to the full inspection history, and that he preferred to look at everything before he talked to anyone, which Doug relayed to Lena afterward as the clearest possible sign that the man knew what he was doing. Lena arrived at the building on Thursday morning at 7:45 and found Walter Greer already there. He was standing on the sidewalk in front of the northeast corner, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots that had seen more job sites than most of the people who would ever hire him, holding a small flashlight and looking at the exterior of the foundation wall with the particular quality of attention that has nothing performative in it. He was not taking notes, he was not photographing, he was looking. He was a compact man, not tall, with white hair cropped close and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work without being hardened by it. He glanced at Lena when she approached and gave her a nod that was neither warm nor cold, simply the acknowledgement of a person who had been expected. She introduced herself, he said he knew. He said he had read all 4 reports on the drive down, which she understood to mean he had had someone read them to him, or he had read them the night before, because reading 4 engineering reports on a 3-hour drive from Steinbach was not something she imagined a 71-year-old man doing casually. But she did not ask. She laid out the situation the way she had learned to lay things out, factually, completely, without editorializing. She told him about the acquisition, the routine inspection, the flagging, the 4 reports, the $1.4 million combined estimate, and the timeline she was working against, which included a tenant lease that needed resolution within 60 days and a lender who had been asking increasingly pointed questions about the asset's status. Walter listened with his hands in his jacket pockets. When she finished, he said one thing. He asked if she had the original construction documents for the building. She said she had requested them from the city's permit office and they were supposed to arrive by end of week. He asked if she could get them sooner. She said she would try. He nodded and turned back to the wall. She stood beside him for a moment and then asked what he was looking for. He said he was not sure yet, which was not the answer she had been expecting, but which she recognized, from the particular way he said it, as more honest than most of the answers she had been given by people who were very certain. He spent the first day in the building. He had brought a core sampling kit, a piece of equipment Lena had not seen outside of a laboratory context, and he used it to extract 3 small cylinders of concrete from different sections of the foundation at depths and locations he selected himself, according to a logic he did not explain and that Lena did not ask him to. He worked methodically and without any apparent urgency, which she found both calming and quietly maddening, because urgency was the water she had been swimming in for 6 weeks, and here was a man who seemed to exist at a different temperature entirely. His granddaughter had come with him. She was 11 years old, named Petra, a serious-faced girl with red hair who sat in a folding camp chair near the entrance, with a book that she read with complete absorption until her grandfather occasionally said her name, at which point she would set the book down and come hold something, or hand him something with the practiced ease of a child who had been doing this since she was old enough to be trusted near concrete dust. She did not talk to Lena directly for most of the first day, but once, mid-afternoon, when Lena was standing near the entrance looking at something on her phone, Petra looked up from her book and said, without preamble, that her grandfather always said buildings were like people. They could look broken on the outside and still be fine, or look fine on the outside and be broken in a way nobody had found yet. Then she looked back at her book. Lena lowered her phone and looked at the girl. She did not have a response to that, which was not something that happened to her often. On the second day, Walter Greer asked her 3 questions. The first was whether there had been any changes to the drainage infrastructure on the adjacent properties in the last 10 years, roadwork, utility installation, anything that might have redirected surface water or groundwater flow near the northeast corner. Lena said she did not know, but she would find out. The second question was whether any of the 4 engineering firms had performed petrographic analysis on their core samples, or whether they had relied on visual and mechanical assessment alone. She pulled up the reports on her tablet and read through them and told him she did not see any reference to petrographic analysis in any of the 4. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. The third question was whether the building had ever been used to store road salt or de-icing chemicals, either in the basement level or in ground floor commercial units. She did not know the answer to that either. She found out by end of day. A city infrastructure project in 2014 had installed new storm drainage on the adjacent block, redirecting flow in a pattern that, as best as she could determine from the engineering drawings she obtained from the city records office, would have increased subsurface water movement along the northeast corner of her building's footprint. The basement of the building had been leased to a landscaping company from 2009 to 2016 that had, according to a lease addendum she found in the acquisition documents she had not previously looked at closely, used part of the space for seasonal storage, including, listed in the addendum with no further comment, road treatment materials. She sent all of this to Walter Greer at 9:30 in the evening. He replied 12 minutes later with a single sentence. He said the core samples were already telling him something and he would know more by tomorrow afternoon. On the third day, he came to the entrance of the building at 2 o'clock, brushed the dust from his jacket and told her to come inside. He had set up a work light in the northeast corner of the basement level, and he stood beside it and spoke without theatrics or preamble, the way someone speaks when they have found what they were looking for and no longer need to be careful about managing expectations. The concrete in the northeast corner, he told her, was deteriorating. That part was accurate. What was not accurate was the cause, and the cause was everything. 3 of the 4 reports had identified alkali-silica reactivity as the mechanism of deterioration. They were correct that ASR was present. They were incorrect in identifying it as the primary or original cause of the damage. What they had missed, and what the petrographic analysis of his core samples had made clear, was that the ASR had been triggered and dramatically accelerated by chloride penetration. Road salt, stored in the basement for 7 years, present in elevated concentrations in the soil along the northeast wall following the 2014 drainage change. The chloride had done 2 things simultaneously. It had destabilized the concrete's internal chemistry in a way that activated ASR in aggregate that might otherwise have remained dormant for decades, and it had initiated corrosion of the reinforcing steel inside the foundation wall, which was the actual source of the cracking patterns that everyone had photographed and none of them had correctly explained. This mattered because the damage, while real, was localized. It was confined to a 12-meter section of the northeast wall and a limited portion of the adjoining slab. It was not systemic. It was not progressing through the full foundation. The building was not failing. One specific section of one wall had been chemically attacked by a combination of factors over a 15-year period and had sustained damage that was serious, addressable, and nowhere close to requiring demolition of the entire structure. The repair, he said, involved removing and replacing the compromised section of the foundation wall using a cathodic protection system for the rebar, sealing the exterior drainage path that was still carrying chloride-contaminated water toward the building, and a monitoring protocol for the following 2 years to confirm that the damage had been contained. He named a firm in Saskatoon that specialized in exactly this type of remediation, and that had done 3 similar projects in the Prairie provinces in the last decade. He estimated the repair at somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000, depending on what was found once the wall section was opened. He could not be more precise than that until the remediation contractor had done their own assessment. But he was confident in the diagnosis because the samples were clear and the history was consistent, and the math of it, as he put it, was not complicated once you had all the pieces in the right order. Lena stood in the basement of her building and looked at the wall that 4 engineers had told her could not be saved. She did not say anything for a long moment. She was a person who believed in processing information before responding to it, and she was processing a great deal at once. She was processing the gap between $1.4 million and $100,000. She was processing the fact that 4 firms had looked at the same building and none of them had asked about drainage history or storage history or run a single petrographic test. She was processing what it meant that a 71-year-old man who drove from Steinbach and charged what she was beginning to suspect was a completely unreasonable daily rate had found in 3 days what nobody else had found in 6 weeks. She asked him why no one else had tested for chloride penetration as a primary cause. He thought about this for a moment without appearing to feel any particular need to be diplomatic about it. He said that ASR was the most common diagnosis for this presentation of damage in concrete of this age and this climate region, and that most practitioners defaulted to it because it was correct often enough that the default was usually justified. The problem, he said, was that when you were looking at a 1.4 million decision, usually justified was not a standard that should satisfy anyone. What he had done was not extraordinary, it was simply thorough. He had asked where the chloride might have come from before he had accepted that chloride was not the issue, and asking that question had led him somewhere. He picked up his work light and folded it. Petra appeared from around the corner of the basement where she had apparently been reading in the light from one of the high windows, retrieved her camp chair, folded it under one arm, and looked at Lena with the same frank assessment she had offered on the first day. Buildings that look broken can still be okay, she said, with the mild authority of someone repeating a fact they have been told many times and have come to regard as simply true. Lena looked at the girl. She said that she was beginning to understand that. In the car on the way back to the site office, Lena called Doug Price and told him what Walter Greer had found. Doug listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened when the information was significant. At the end of it, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had figured it was something like that. She asked him why. He said because the building didn't feel condemned. He said that he had been in enough buildings that were actually failing to know what that felt like, and this one didn't feel that way. She told him that she was not sure structural engineering worked on instinct. He said he was not sure it didn't. She met with Walter Greer the following morning to discuss his findings formally and to receive the written report he had prepared overnight, a document that was terse and precise and that she read in full before he had finished his coffee. She asked whether he would be willing to make himself available if the remediation process raised additional questions. He said yes at his standard day rate. She asked what his standard day rate was. He named a figure that made her pause, not because it was high, but because it was lower than what she paid for a junior associate at any of the 4 engineering firms, and she looked at him for a moment trying to decide whether to say something about that. She asked him why he charged what he charged. He shrugged, a small economical gesture that communicated a long familiarity with the question. He said he had a pension and a house that was paid for and a granddaughter who visited most weekends. He said he did not need more than he needed. He said the work was what he came for, not the invoice. Then he said something she had not expected him to say. He told her that before he left he wanted to show her one more thing. He took her back to the northeast corner and showed her a spot near the base of the wall where a previous repair had been done at some point, a patch of slightly different colored concrete, not well matched, not recent, not documented anywhere in any of the inspection records she had provided. Someone had known about a problem in this corner before. Someone had addressed it in a way that was insufficient and had left no record of it. He did not speculate about when or why. He simply pointed to it and let it sit there in the light. She stared at it for a long time. She was thinking about the acquisition due diligence, about what had been inspected and what had been signed off, and what had apparently been overlooked or not disclosed, and she filed that thought carefully in the part of her mind reserved for things that would need to be addressed through channels she was not ready to open yet. Walter Greer was already moving toward the stairs. She followed him up into the light. The remediation firm in Saskatoon confirmed Walter's diagnosis within a week. Their assessment came in at $94,000, including all materials, the cathodic protection installation, exterior drainage correction, and a monitoring protocol. They said the work could begin in the new year and would take approximately 6 weeks. Lena authorized it before the call was over. She called the 4 engineering firms, not to be confrontational, but because she was a person who believed that information should travel in both directions, and what Walter Greer had found was information that had implications for how concrete assessments were being conducted in their industry. 2 of the firms responded with interest and some degree of professional discomfort. One firm responded with a letter from their legal department which she found instructive. The 4th did not respond at all. She drove to Steinbach on a Saturday in December, not because there was any professional reason to, but because she had found that she wanted to. She had Walter Greer's address from the paperwork and she had called ahead, which he had seemed neither pleased nor displeased by, simply matter of fact, in the way he was matter of fact about most things. The property outside Steinbach was a modest acreage with a workshop that was clearly the most maintained structure on the land. The house was comfortable and unremarkable. Petra's bicycle was leaned against the porch railing. The yard had the look of a place that had been lived in practically and without performance, cleared where it needed to be cleared and left alone where it didn't. Walter came out when she pulled in, drying his hands on a cloth, and she offered him the bottle of scotch she had brought, which he accepted without comment and set on the porch railing. Petra appeared behind him, assessed Lena briefly with the same evaluating gaze from the job site, and then asked if she wanted to see the workshop. Walter said in a tone that established clearly that Petra had asked this question about other visitors before, and that the question was one he had learned to let proceed, that Lena could decide for herself. Lena said she would like to see the workshop. It was organized the way she would have expected. Tools arranged with the logic of long use, reference binders on a shelf that had been consulted so many times the spines had softened, a concrete sample collection in labeled jars that lined an entire shelf with a kind of quiet dedication that made her think of a naturalist's cabinet. In the corner, propped against the wall, was a child's drawing of a building in crayon, windows bright yellow, a figure standing in front of it that was clearly meant to be a man, and beside him a smaller figure that was clearly meant to be a girl. Beneath it, in careful child's handwriting, a label, "Grandpa Fixing Buildings." She looked at it for a moment. Petra, standing behind her, said that she had made it 2 years ago when she was 9 and that she knew the perspective wasn't right but that she had wanted to draw it anyway. Lena said the perspective looked fine to her. On the drive back to Winnipeg, she thought about what the week had actually cost. Not the remediation, which was money she understood how to account for, but the 6 weeks before Walter Greer's name had appeared on a folded piece of paper on her desk. 6 weeks of 4 reports, each one more expensive and more final sounding than the last. 6 weeks during which she had been moving steadily toward a decision that would have cost her 14 times what the actual repair required, would have displaced a tenant, would have removed from the north end of the city a building that had stood since 1987, and that was going to stand for considerably longer, now that someone had asked the right question about road salt and a city drainage project from a decade ago. She had not been careless. She had done what the system said to do. She had gotten second opinions and third opinions and fourth opinions. What she had not done was ask whether the consensus was correct, which was a different question than whether the consensus existed. 4 people agreeing was data. 4 people agreeing without anyone running a petrographic test or asking what had been stored in the basement was something else. She added Walter Greer's number to her contacts under a category she reserved for people she considered genuinely indispensable, a category that did not have many entries. She typed a note beneath it. Steinbach asks the right question first. The building on the north end reopened in March. The remediation had come in at $97,000, slightly over Walter's estimate, because the wall section had revealed one additional area of chloride penetration that had not been visible in the original sampling, but that the remediation team addressed while they had the wall open. The tenant signed a new 3-year lease. The lender received the remediation report and the monitoring documentation and closed the file without further questions. On the first warm Saturday in April, Lena drove past the building on her way to a site visit elsewhere in the city. She did not stop. She slowed down and looked at the northeast corner, the repaired wall section already weathering naturally into the surrounding concrete. The building standing the way it had always stood, the way it would continue to stand for years that she had come close to preventing. She thought briefly and precisely about the 4 reports still sitting in a folder on her desk. She thought about what it meant to be credentialed and expert and expensive and wrong, not maliciously wrong, not incompetently wrong in any way that anyone would be sanctioned for. Wrong in the way that happens when very qualified people ask the most obvious question instead of the most necessary one, and the building pays for it, or nearly does. Then she drove on, because she had 3 other sites to visit, and the day was clear and the roads in Winnipeg were finally dry, and there was work to do in the particular way that work always waited, patient and specific and entirely indifferent to how long you had taken to get there.